Post World War II, Europe was devastated because of all the damage towards them from the war, Europe's economy being heavily in debt to the US, as well as shortages of food and raw materials. Unemployment was very high and Europe was just falling apart. As to the US, they have experienced phenomenal economic growth. Stalin during this time wanted to expand and conquer many other weak countries in Eastern Europe. The US became petrified of the Soviet becoming a superpower. Cold War has begun. From 1947 until 1991, US being a superpower over capitalism, opposed to the Soviet being communism. Very high tensions occurred, where the US tried to contain all the countries from being communist under the influence of Russia.
Fidel Castro came to power in Cuba in 1959. After leading a successful revolution against dictatorial regime Fulgencio Batista, almost from the start, the United States was worried about Castro and his leftist politics. Castro was a charismatic leader and got the support of many people in Cuba. He implemented agrarian reform, expropriated foreign oil company holdings, and eventually seized all foreign-owned property in Cuba. He also established close diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union, and Russians were soon providing them with economic and military aid. Castro repeatedly and loudly accused the US of attempting to topple his administration. From the beginning of 1960, a number of American congressmen and senators condemned Castro. By June, the Congress had passed legislation enabling President Dwight D. Eisenhower to retaliate. The United States stopped importing sugar from Cuba, and shortly after, it imposed embargo acts on most exports to Cuba. By January 1961, the United States had severed diplomatic relations with Cuba. Following a year of severely strained relations between the United States and Cuba, Cuban leader Fidel Castro openly declared that he is a Marxist/Leninist. The announcement sealed the bitter Cold War animosity between the two nations.
Before his inauguration, John F. Kennedy was briefed on a plan by the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, developed during the Eisenhower administration to train Cuban exiles for an invasion of their homeland. The plan anticipated that the Cuban people and the elements of the Cuban military would support the invasion. The ultimate goal was the overthrow of Castro and the establishment of a non-communist government friendly to the United States. President Eisenhower came up with a plan for the training of the Bay of Pigs. He approved the program in March of 1960. The CIA set up training camps in Guatemala, and by November, the operation had trained a small army for an assault, landing, and guerrilla warfare. Jose Miro Cardona led the anti-Castro Cuban exiles in the United States, a former member of Castro's government. He was the head of the Cuban Revolutionary Council, an exile committee. Cardona was poised to take over the provisional presidency of Cuba if the invasion succeeded. The official efforts to keep the invasion preparation secret, Miami's Cuban exile community was aware of them. Castro was made aware of the guerrilla training camps in Guatemala by Cuban intelligence as early as October 1960, and the news media covered the developments extensively. Not long after his inauguration, President Kennedy approved the assault strategy in February 1961. He was determined to cover up American assistance. The lie included the Bay of Pigs landing spot.
The original invasion plan called for 2 airstrikes against Cuban air bases. Undercover at night, a 1,400-man invading force would unload and launch a surprise assault. Transport would be disrupted, and Cuban forces would be repelled by paratroopers who would drop before the assault. A smaller force would arrive on Cuba's east coast at the same time to cause chaos. The main force would advance across the island to Matanzas and set up a defensive position. The United Revolutionary Front would send leaders from South Florida and establish a provisional government. The success of the plan depended on the Cuban population joining the invaders.
April 15th, 1961, 8 aircraft departed Nicaragua for Cuba to bomb its airfields, which resulted in the first accident. The CIA painted old World War II B-26 bombers to resemble Cuban Air Force aircraft. Most of Castro's Air Force was unharmed, and the bombers missed several of their targets. Photos of the American jets that had been painted demonstrated American backing for the invasion as news of the raid spread. A second airstrike was canceled by President Kennedy. Brigade 2506, an invading force made up of Cuban exiles, touched down on the beaches near the Bay of Pigs on April 17th. Almost immediately, they came under intense fire. Cuban aircraft bombed the invaders, sunk 2 escorting ships, and decimated the exiles' air force by half. The ground force was handicapped by bad weather, which forced it to use wet equipment and limited supplies of ammunition. Over the next 24 hours, Castro ordered roughly 20,000 troops to advance toward the beach, and the Cuban Air Force continued to control the skies. As the situation grew increasingly grim, President Kennedy authorized an air umbrella. At dawn on April 19, 6 unmarked American fighter planes took off to help defend the brigade's P-26 aircraft flying. But the planes arrived an hour late, most likely confused by the change in time zones between Nicaragua and Cuba. They were shot down by the Cubans, and the invasion was crushed later that day. Some exiles escaped to the sea, while the rest were killed or rounded up and imprisoned by Castro's forces. Almost 1,200 members of Brigade 2506 surrendered, and more than 100 were killed. This was a failure.
As a result of the Bay of Pigs invasion failure, Kennedy spoke out and said important things in this speech.
I have emphasized before that this was a struggle of Cuban patriots against a Cuban dictator. While we could not be expected to hide our sympathies, we made it repeatedly clear that the armed forces of this country would not intervene in any way. But let the record show that our restraint is not inexhaustible. Should it ever appear that the inter-American doctrine of non-interference merely conceals or excuses a policy of non-action, if the nations of this hemisphere should fail to meet their commitments against outside communist penetration, then I want it clearly understood that this government will not hesitate in meeting its primary obligations, which are to the security of our nation. Nor would we expect or accept the same outcome which this small band of gallant Cuban refugees must have known that they were chancing, determined as they were against heavy odds to pursue their courageous attempts to regain their island's freedom. It is not the first time that communist tanks have rolled over gallant men and women fighting to redeem the independence of their homeland. Nor is it by any means the final episode in the eternal struggle of liberty against tyranny anywhere on the face of the globe, including Cuba itself.
In this speech given by President Kennedy, he took responsibility for the failure and acknowledged the mistakes that he made. He accepted that he underestimated Fidel Castro's Cuban leadership and expressed regret for the loss of many American lives. He also acknowledged the importance of learning from your mistakes, and this helped him restore some credibility after the failed invasion. The United States and Fidel Castro negotiated a solution. The brigade captives were held captive for 20 months. Castro finally agreed to $53 million worth of food, and medicine in return for the prisoners, after Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy personally begged pharmaceutical and baby food producers for donations. After the Bay of Pigs invasion, which the United States attempted to use to overthrow Castro's regime in Cuba, and as Kennedy's administration was preparing Operation Mongoose, Soviet Premier Leader Nikita Khrushchev and Cuban Prime Minister Fidel Castro made an undercover deal in July 1962 to deploy Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. As a result of this, Kennedy blockaded Cuba on October 22, 1962. Following considerable consulting with his military and foreign policy advisors, the two sides stood on the brink of a nuclear war. But Khrushchev surrendered 6 days later, and the missiles were dismantled. Kennedy shut down its own missile bases in Turkey in response. The Cold War's most steadily and direct exchange between the US and the USSR occurred at this time, and it also marked the superpowers' closest approach to the nuclear exchange.
This was the end of the conflict involving nuclear weapons during the Cold War. As a result of the US closing agreements with the Soviet Union, the ending stated that Cuba will remain communist, leaving the US off containment towards them. This was the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis.